Welcome to by far the most important lesson on this course. Lesson 7. We're going to talk about contrast. I know it wasn't in the title, but there it is. I hope it's a surprise. You know, it doesn't have to be a surprise, but that's what we're talking about. And I say it's the most important aspect of photography and Lightroom because it really is what creates interest, depth, detail, sharpness, everything. You need contrast in your photograph. All right, you might be thinking about the contrast slider in Lightroom, but that's not exactly what I'm talking about. It is the same thing technically, but I don't ever use that slider, and I love contrast. So here, let me show you what that slider does and let me explain it to you. The contrast slider in Lightroom adjusts the difference between the light and the dark areas, which subsequently makes contrast. You can see it in this photograph here. Contrast slider down, less contrast between the dark areas and the light areas. Contrast slider up, significantly more contrast between those light and dark areas. But what I'm talking about is contrast everything. So everywhere in your photograph, not just the midtones or the bright areas or the dark areas. And to get us rolling on this, let me show you some drawings I've made. So on this piece of paper, you've got this black circle. That black circle is super sharp, right? You can see all the details. You can see the edges. You know that it's there. It's in focus and it's sharp. Whereas with this black circle, it's got a gradient and it's not as sharp. You can't really see all the detail that's in the center and it feels like it's kind of spread all over the place. Now take a look at this circle. This circle is blue, and while it might have the same edge consistency as the first black dot I showed you, it is a similar color to this piece of paper, which does remove some of that sharpness that you might want. Do you get what I'm saying here? All right, I have a series of photographs that I'm going to run through here with you, and I'm just going to point out what the contrast is in the photograph and why it looks a specific way. And some photos are bad, so we'll point out what it needs. This photograph here, there are multiple different types of contrast here. There's size contrast. This is a big tree. Those are little birds. There is a brightness contrast between the tree and the sky, right? Not only that, but if you zoom in, there is a solid, straightaway, no transition contrast between the branches and the sky. That's important because, as I showed you with this circle right here, in order for something to be tack sharp like this circle, it needs to go from one color to the next color. If these branches were slowly becoming lighter and lighter and lighter, they would look something like this. You see that circle? Now imagine if the branches looked like this circle. We would look at the photograph and we would say, that is not a sharp photo. Moving on to the next photo, there's an obvious color contrast. You see this person's eyes is a completely opposite color than everything around that person's eyes. And on top of that, the eyes are framed within this metal gate here, which is darker than the background and bigger than you'd usually expect. Not only that, but there's also a person in the bottom left who acts as a contrast in size between the painting and reality. To intentionally get the color contrast that you see in this photograph, you can use a color wheel to guide you on field. Basically, contrast in colors is one side of the wheel against another side of the wheel. So for example, over here, this red versus over here, this light blue. That's a color contrast right there. It doesn't look that good, but you get the point. Next photo. There's a contrast here in depth of field. You can see that the spider is sharp and that everything behind it is blurry. This is a type of contrast that allows you to add depth and make your photo feel three-dimensional. Not only that, but there is a color and brightness contrast between the spider and the background. So let's zoom in here. You can see that the spider is a different color than everything behind it, and it's a different brightness than everything behind it. This helps the spider be sharp and interesting, and it makes the photo have depth. Moving on to the next photo, we got this clock tower, church tower thingamajigabob, and it feels tack sharp, even though the color of the tower is similar to the color of the sky. What's going on here is the edges of this subject are darkened compared to the sky. Even if this part here is a similar brightness and color to this part here, the edge separates it and helps it pop out and become three-dimensional. Next photo, it's a bad photo. It's an okay photo. But the thing I want to point out here is that this image feels flat. And the reason is there are almost no shadows. There are almost no differences between the edges and the bumps and the deeper parts of this ridge, which is because I shot during a time where the sun was shining directly at this wall, and it took away all my opportunity for shadows. In order for the human eye to perceive detail, there needs to be a difference. Take a look at this circle. There is no circle because there's no difference. You don't see anything there because there's no difference between here and here. But if you have something with a difference on it, you start to see detail. The same applies for when you're outside or when you're editing your photos. Obviously, I can add some shadows back into these areas, and then there would be a difference and the photo might look slightly more interesting. You can see here I'm adding in some difference with this contrast slider, with the shadow slider, with the black slider. There's a little bit more difference, which makes it a tiny bit more interesting, especially on this ridge. But I would highly encourage you to try to get that difference on field when you're taking the photo. So plan your shots. Make sure your lighting is planned so that you get the shadows that you want to get or the shadows that you don't want to get. Do whatever you would like. The point in this is that you can get contrast, which is detail, depth, sharpness, interest on field, and digitally. One other slider that I want to talk about is the clarity slider. This affects contrast in a unique way. Basically, if you adjust the clarity, it increases or decreases the difference between the dark and bright areas of the midtones, which can result in a really soft image or a really, really hard image. It depends on what you're shooting for, but if you're taking cityscape photos, you might want to increase your clarity. If you're taking portraits, you might want to decrease your clarity. If you're taking photos of the ocean or like mist, or I don't know, it depends. It depends on what you want to get. If you want dreamy, go lower. If you want like serious, cinematic, go a little bit higher. Another image we have here is a black and white image. I made it black and white because it doesn't look all that good in color. But what I want to point out is that the focus is on his hat, except for there are a lot of things that aren't in focus that kind of add to the scene. This is focus contrast. With focus contrast, you're not necessarily making your photos sharp, but more interesting, and maybe you're adding in a lot of depth. People will use this for landscape photos. They'll put something in the foreground, like these branches, and then focus on something in the background, like this person or mountains or whatever you want it to be, and then something even further in the background might be in focus, might not be in focus. Moving on to our last photograph, I want to point out the scale contrast in this photograph. Obviously, there's a lot of other things going on that make it interesting, but one of the things that makes it interesting is the difference in scale. This bird is small compared to these trees. Okay, that is lesson 7. I went kind of slowly because I think this idea of contrast is super important and it will change the way that you shoot your photos and edit them. I want you to be able to look at the photographs and see what I'm talking about. Just remember that contrast creates depth, detail, sharpness, and interest. All right, thank you for watching. I'll see you in lesson 8.